going to start the recording. Hopefully everyone, see a couple people are having some trouble connecting to audio, so I'm hoping you can hear me even if you can't see me. But welcome everyone, Tanchi Kiawao, Lucy Fowler, Dishnakashon, Winnipeg Dushchin, Naga Dan Kiskea, Niwikin. I'm Lucy Fowler. I'm a member of the Mamawi Project collective from Winnipeg, but living in the Dominican Republic right now, or the land that is supposed to be called Kiskea. I'm really excited for all of you to be here tonight for this second installment of the Mamawi Aachimotaak series. So this visiting series came about out of our last gathering of folks, and we kind of talked about what do we want to see the Mamawi Project do next. And folks wanted to have a chance to kind of come together and talk about things that impact us in our communities, and also have a chance for folks to share their expertise as well. So our first event was with Kai Pyle. I see them here in the room tonight, so that's awesome. Talking about Two-Spirit Métis experiences and histories. And so tonight we have the amazing Shanese Steele here to talk about Black Métis experiences. And so we also have a wonderful video to launch with Shanice's presentation. I'm really looking forward to all this. Shanice is going to go into their intro at the beginning, so I'm just going to turn it over to you, Shanice. Welcome, and we will get started.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me a sec. Also, I have two screens. So if you see me looking up to the right, I promise you I'm not like staring at a spirit in the corner. I'm just looking at my screen. I always like to let people know that beforehand, because it's like I'm supposed to be looking like this, but I'm looking up like this. So I just wanted to let folks know. So hello, everybody. I'm going to go into my introduction in just a little bit. But I'm just excited to be here tonight with you all and to have this conversation about Black Métis people, Black Métis identity. What does that mean? What does that look like? And to just converse about, I guess, the experiences folks have had around trying to talk about Black Métis people, even within your own communities. Also, if the slides take a little long to get to the next one, I do apologize. Internet. It's supposed to make life easier, but it really doesn't sometimes when it comes to Zoom. This is the agenda for tonight. So we have the opening, and then I'm going to get into a bit about who I am, so where I come from, my positionality. I'm going to talk a bit about, my experiences through life. We're then going to watch the video that we've created, which is super awesome. I'm actually very appreciative of the fact that my spoken word poem was chosen to be included in the video. So that's going to be really awesome. Then I'm going to talk a bit about anti-Blackness. So what does it look like? How do we get rid of it? What are some of the tools and steps that you can take? And then we're going to have an open discussion. And I really hope folks will participate in that part because you don't have to be Black to talk about combating anti-Black racism in our communities. It's really important that we're all taking a role and a responsibility within this conversation. So who am I? Well, I'm going to introduce myself in Anishinaabe right now. So Nim Bojo Buju Shanice and Dishnakas and Dobo to go Anishinaabe Jijak and Dodam. Anishinaabe Makade Kwe, Anishinaabe Métis. Toronto Dunjaba, Minwa Nabising Dunjaba, Minwa Adopakang Dunjaba, and Debenjigan and Nakuya Potawatomi. So hello everyone, my name is Shanese Steele. I'm currently situated on the traditional territory of the Potawatomi people here in Decatur, Illinois. So much like Lucy, I'm not in my traditional territory right now. However, I'm here visiting on these lands. My partner lives here. And I just wanted to acknowledge these territories and the relationship that a lot of people have to these lands, and specifically the Potawatomi people. A lot of folks don't think of Illinois as a very native state, as a very indigenous state. However, Illinois is actually an indigenous nation, the Illinois people, Illinois Miami people. And they had close relationships with the Anishinaabe. And so the Potawatomi were originally here. Unfortunately, they had much like a trail of tears like the Cherokee and were forcibly removed out of these territories. But it's important that when I'm looking around outside, when any of us are looking around outside, that we look for those elements of the people who were here before us. And for me, it's seeing the wild strawberries out on the land that I see here. It makes me think of Anishinaabe people. It makes me think of my Métis family growing up and picking wild berries off of the land. And so that's my connection to the land around me. And I'm very thankful that those medicines are still here out on the land. I am Afro-Métis, so my father is Black. He hails from Trinidad and Carriacou, Grenada. Carriacou is a very small island. It has about 8,000 people. So extremely, extremely tiny, very tight-knit community. I think of it oftentimes the same way I think of a lot of Métis communities, very tight-knit. Everyone knows everyone by their last names, and that's how you can tell whose family is who. And oftentimes it reminds me a lot of those of us who are Métis and how we connect through last names. My mom is Métis. Her last name is Delaron. She comes from the Delaron family, which for many, I'm sure you know, is a pretty big Métis family. And we have ties to the Brissettes and the Hirondelles as well. And so I grew up with Métis culture without knowing that it's Métis culture. I have these really great photos of my great uncles and great grandfather playing the fiddle in the kitchen. And that was a part of my family growing up, the fiddle and jigging. I did a lot of jigging growing up. And I didn't realize that it was Métis culture at the time. I think like a lot of people, there's a disconnect from community sometimes when we're trying to hide because of colonization, right? And the violence that our community faces. And so I didn't always know it was Métis culture, but I always had Métis culture around me. So yeah, I grew up in Toronto, or Dopakong, which is the Anishinaabe word for North York, which is where I grew up. You might have heard the word before, Etobicoke, which is also a Dopakong, and it means the place of many trees. So my grandmother, my Métis grandmother, when she was growing up in North York, it still was the place of many trees. And we forget that in a lot of the major cities that we see. We think that, you know, those histories are erased or those stories are erased. But if you just take the time and talk to your elders, your aunties and your uncles and your grandmas and your cousins, they'll tell you the stories of what that land used to look like before all the concrete buildings started coming up, right? Especially cities like Toronto. I think people think it's been so long since Toronto was a place of fields and farms and trees, but it wasn't that long ago. It very much was in my grandmother's lifetime. So it's important to remember that underneath that concrete, that land is still there and we can still connect to it. I've been on this journey of finding myself, of figuring out who I am since I was 15. So almost 15 years now. I'm aging myself. I'm almost 30. I was gonna say 13 years, but then I realized I just turned 29. So it's been 14 years since I've been on this journey of finding myself, right? And I think for a lot of Métis folks, for those of us who grow outside of the prairies, grow up outside of the prairies, we don't get the same access to our culture that others might get, right? Toronto, I would say, is a very Anishinaabe heavy city. So it's very easy to find Anishinaabe culture in the city of Toronto. It's not as easy, but it's easy to find Haudenosaunee culture. But when it comes to Métis community, we're not usually talked about in the city that much, right? So I didn't grow up with other Métis people around me. I was the only self-identifying Indigenous person in my entire high school. I went to a predominantly Black high school, and no one knew what Native people were, and they sure as hell didn't know what Métis was. That was definitely a journey of trying to explain that to people while also trying to figure out what that means to me. And I think a lot of us end up in those boats where we're trying to figure out who we are while also trying to explain it to other people who don't have a deep understanding of what our culture is and what our people are. And so this journey has been a long one, but it's been a good one. And it's been a good one because of the people that I was able to meet around me. I was able to meet other Afro-Métis folks, someone specifically, Simone Blay, who created the video that we're going to watch today. But Simone was actually the first Afro-Métis person that I met outside of my own family. I really didn't think we existed. I thought we were a rarity growing up. I was like, this is just some random thing that happened by luck, by chance. And then I started meeting other folks who were like, oh, I'm Métis as well. And I really got involved in community and culture. I spend some time working with the MNO, whatever relationship folks have with them. But I started working with the MNO, and while, there can be some criticisms, there was an opportunity for me to connect with people and culture in a way that I wasn't able to access before. And I think that's what's really important about creating spaces or having spaces for Métis folks, is making sure that it's inclusive of Afro-Métis folks as well. And so, yeah, it was a journey of trying to find those accepting spaces. Lucy was one of those people that I met that never made me feel uncomfortable or never made me feel like my identity as a Métis person was being questioned. And I think that's really important, right? Is finding those folks who support you in your journey and your identity. And so, yeah, this is a bit about who I am, about my connection to my culture and finding myself. It's not that different than other Métis folks. I think there's this idea that, Black Métis folks somehow you have this very different experience. And it's different in some ways. I'll be honest about that. It's obviously not the same in its entirety. However, that journey of reclaiming yourself, of looking for who you are, of, trying to find elders and community, it's very much the same as everyone else, right? It's finding your place within community, within the people that you want to be in connection with. And so I don't want people to be too afraid in approaching Afro-Métis folks and having these conversations about their own journey, because they very much are on the same journey as you. They might be experiencing some anti-Black racism in that journey, and that's where it will differ. But they also need support from fellow Métis folks too. So don't be afraid to have those conversations, to even give tips and tricks to Afro-Métis folks who are coming into the community for the first time, because they're going to be looking for the very same things that you're looking for, right? Which is connection, which is access, which is resources, which was the journey that I was on, which was trying to connect to those things. So I'm going to play this video for you. It's entitled Not Your Typical Métis. I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to explain how it came to be, why I wrote this poem, what it means to me as an Afro-Métis person. And I really hope folks are able to enjoy it and understand, I think, where I'm coming from as an Afro-Métis person. I'm going to share it. If there's any issues with the sound or anything, if folks can just put it in the chat, I can see the chat right now and I'll be able to fix it on my end. But yeah, I'm going to play it right now. Let me start it from the beginning. Of course, it's going to take forever. Okay.
I am not your typical Métis. I do not fit in the confines of the images found in newspapers, on walls, in pamphlets, and media. I am not your typical Métis. Faces filled with blue eyes and covered in blonde hair, where women are erased because for some reason, men were the only people who could be Métis. As if our very existence could not happen without an indigenous woman, lives given to children who would always walk two paths, breathing their souls into people so vibrant that we refuse to be forgotten. I am not your typical Métis. I do not fit the stereotype. This hair ain't so blonde, and this skin is touched with a color that could never be called white. Stained with the blood of those who came before me. What those books forget to say is we have never laid dormant, birthing a fire so bright that this nation could not ignore us. I am not your typical Métis. I won't be found in coloring books given to children by their teachers, Métis men and women whose faces are stripped, making way for society's colonial ideals of what we should look like to take hold. Leaving faces chained by prejudice, lives lost by ignorance, voices forgotten in conversation and lost forever. I am not your typical Métis. Those features you think you know, building barriers for me to climb over, constantly defending who I am, who I was meant to be. I am not your typical Métis.
Let me just put my camera back on. So this is a poem that I actually wrote in my third year of university, while I was at Trent University. And it came about because I had been a part of a program with the MNO. And there had been a couple of times where I had encountered folks who were confused about my appearance, about why I was in spaces. I'll never forget the first time I had walked into a meeting for a specific program, and someone had said to me, "Oh, I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just some random Black girl. Like, I didn't think you were supposed to be here." And I remember being like, why would I just walk into this space? Like, even if I was a random Black person, like, why would I just walk into this space and sit down with you all and gather notebooks and other M&O swag and sit here to have this conversation, right? Like, what would be the reason behind that? And I realized that after talking to other Afro-Métis folks, they had experienced similar things of not being seen as a part of community. And when I asked them why, it seemed to be that they were meeting folks who had this very specific idea of what Métis was supposed to look like. And a lot of that comes from, of course, our colonial school systems, right, that depict Métis people as one way. And oftentimes that one way that they depict Métis people is usually men. When I was in school, they never talked about Métis women. They only ever talked about Métis men. And still, even within that conversation, you know, the men looked a very particular way. And I think that was pushing the narrative, right? That, you know, Métis folks looked white, but still practiced indigenous culture, right? There was this very specific reason why the government was pushing this narrative of what Métis people were supposed to be and supposed to look like. And it was really about disconnecting Métis people from their relations, from First Nation folks, from Inuit folks, from other indigenous peoples. And now that I'm older, I understand where that comes from. I understand that comes from, you know, the Northwestern resistance and when Métis folks and First Nation folks were coming together to resist colonialism, right? That unification of communities is something the government didn't want to see happen again. And so it meant pushing this propaganda that Métis people, while indigenous, were different, right? That still that model minority kind of conversation that was happening. And it sure as hell did not include Black Métis folks. That imagery of what Métis people were supposed to be did not include someone who looked like me. And I'm on the lighter end, right? Like my features are not necessarily phenotypically Black. And even I oftentimes am not included in what Métis people are supposed to look like. And I noticed no one in my family looked like that either. And so I wanted to start having a conversation about the fact that I'm Métis, but I'm not your typical version of what I'm supposed to look like. And I think a lot of us find that, right? Like, this isn't just the narrative of Afro-Métis folks. This is something that I think a lot of us can relate to. This idea that Métis folks are supposed to look a certain way, are supposed to act a certain way. And we often find that even within community. You might do something that someone says, oh, that's not Métis. Métis people shouldn't do that, right? And that it happens a lot. And so I wanted to address that. I wanted to bring it up. I wanted to kind of rebel against it, right? I wanted that resistance, which is an inherently Métis thing, right? That resistance against colonialism, against this idea of who we are supposed to be and what we are entitled to as Métis people. And so, yeah, I wanted to highlight that. And so I wrote it in my early 20s in university, and then I kind of just put it to the side. And then Simone had approached me and she said, hey, we're doing a video and we want to talk about, you know, Black Métis folks. We want to talk about what that looks like and what that is. And she was like, can you write a poem for us? And I was like, girl, I already got one for you. I've been dealing with this. I've been combating this. I've been thinking about this for years. And so, yeah, that's how this came about. And I'm just so honored that my poem was chosen. I think the video is absolutely beautiful. It is stunning. The graphics is just amazing. Oh, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your words. Oh, you animated it. Okay, your work is absolutely amazing. I just have to say, like, stunning. Because I didn't think I would ever see my poem come to life like this, right? And I think didn't think that other Métis folks would want to hear it. Like, I actually didn't think that. I thought, like, when I wrote this poem, I really felt it was just going to stay with me. This was something that I wrote for myself. It's never going to go anywhere. No one wants to hear it. And so being able to share it with other Métis folks and within community is so important to me. And as like a little side note, I encourage all of you to write about your experiences of being Métis. What does that mean for you? What does that look like? Right? It might sound very similar to my poem. It might be completely different, but we all have this story of our identities. And once again, Black Métis folks' stories might not be so different from yours. So I'm going to give a quick little definition of racism versus anti-Black racism, because I think sometimes folks get a little confused about the definitions. What does that mean? What is that? I thought they were the same thing. Isn't all racism racism? All racism is racism, but Black folks experience racism in a different way. And so the definition of racism, the Webster Dictionary definition, right, is the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to physical appearance and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another, right? So what I really like about that definition is it talks about, you know, power and that superiority of someone over someone else. But anti-Black racism is specifically something that I would say is the base for a lot of racism that we see in our communities, right? Even when you think of colorism within communities, this idea that the darker you are, the less intelligent you are, the less access to resources you should get, right? That's based in anti-Black racism. And a lot of our elders, a lot of our community members had this drilled into them while they were in residential schools, while they were in day schools, right? There was this idea of perpetuating, well, white people are here, indigenous people here, and Black people are right here on the bottom. Right. And so oftentimes when I hear elders say anti-Black things within the Métis community, I know where it comes from. Right. I know that they weren't born hating Black people. I know that it's something that's been taught to them that they don't necessarily recognize as anti-Black. Right. And it happens all of the time. But I think what happens is when it's included in our communities, not only does it alienate Black folks, of course, but it then tells Afro-Métis folks or Afro-Indigenous folks that they too don't belong in community, right? That they're not a part of us, which to me has been such an interesting thing being Métis, because Métis identity is about two cultures coming together, right? It's about that history. It's about that resilience. And I think it was shocking for me to see that Black folks or people mixed with Blackness somehow didn't fit into that story of resistance and resilience, into that story of two strong cultures coming together. I think of, you know, the amazing work that could be done between our communities. I really want to take some time to go out to the prairies and talk to some older Métis folks, because I think about a lot of the Black folks that came up after the Civil War and were free, and that were, you know, settling or trying to find homes in the prairies after they were free. Because during that time, the Canadian government was pushing all of these policies to stop Black folks from coming from the States into Canada. They said Negroes were the American problem. And I think about the fact that at that time, when Black folks were coming into the prairies, that would have been around the same time as the Northwestern resistance. And I wonder if there's stories of Métis communities coming together, right? I wonder if Métis and Black folks were sharing stories of how to resist white colonialism. And I think we don't know those stories because, once again, the system doesn't want to know how powerful we are when we come together, right? When we join hands, when we join resisting against these systems. Oh, you're having a gathering at the end of April. Okay. Listen, I love me the prairies, so I definitely will be there. But yeah, I think of those stories that we don't know, right? Those histories that we don't know. And I think oftentimes we assume that our elders don't have those stories, right? I've met a lot of people that are like, oh, I don't think any older Métis elders really know anything about Black people. And I'm always like, well, did you ask them? Have you had those conversations? Because there's been some Métis elders that I've talked to who talk about the relationships that they built with Black folks over the years, especially during the 60s, right? And the resistance that they talk about and fighting colonialism during that time and white supremacy and violence against Black and brown bodies, right? Black and brown people. And so it's important that when we're talking about how to combat anti-Black racism in our communities, that we're also thinking about, okay, well, who are we asking about those stories? Are we asking our elders, our aunties, our uncles, our grandparents, right? Are we having those conversations? Are we even combating their anti-Black racism that maybe they've internalized, right? I know how hard that is to combat that. You don't want to, you feel like you're being disrespectful, especially when it's an elder in community, right? But it's okay to have those tough conversations with our elders, right? It's okay to talk about the ways in which anti-Black racism was forced on them as well, right? It's not inherently Métis to be anti-Black. That doesn't belong to us. That's not our culture, right? That's something that was given to us. So anti-Black racism can look like anything. It really can. It can look like crossing the street when you see a group of Black people. It can look like believing in, the stereotype of Black on Black crime, which is not factually true, right? It can look like a lot of these things. But I think when I'm thinking about what does anti-Black racism look like in community, it looks like this. So it looks like telling Black people that they can't be Métis, right? Or assuming that they're not Métis. Remember that story that I told you about walking into that space? That was anti-Black racism. Not allowing Black Métis folks access to culture, right? So if there's an event happening and a Black Métis person wants to come and learn how to jig or fiddle, if you're not allowing them access to that, that's anti-Black racism. If it's based on the assumption because they're Black, they can't be Métis. Not allowing Black Métis folks access to language. We already know we have such few Michif speakers, right? We're constantly trying to increase the number of folks who speak our traditional languages, and not allowing Black Métis folks access to that not only is hurting them, but it's also hurting community, right? Not allowing folks to continue our culture and our language on. Not including Black Métis in community in general, that is always going to be anti-Black, right? So if you're having an event, maybe you're having a fish fry, and you don't want to allow Black Métis folks to come and join, that's anti-Black. Not including the voices of Black Métis, I think is such a very important one. Being included in this project here is probably one of the most important things that I think can be done for Black Métis folks, giving us space to talk about our experiences, uplifting our voices when we often aren't heard. Like that is something that's so important. And when you don't include our voices, you're erasing us effectively from community, right? When we're not being heard, when we're not being thought of, when we're not being considered. And to go back to like what anti-Black racism can look like in community, there was a time where I was working for someone. I was working for the M&O. And while I was working there, it was Pride, and myself and Simone had decided to participate in the Black Lives Matter protest that was happening that year at Pride. And we ended up finding out later that folks in our office were joking about photoshopping our faces onto random Black girls' bodies so that they could get us in trouble for participating in a protest, and specifically a protest about Black lives. And we were really upset at the time. And I think it went past just the fact of like, this is anti-Black racism, but the fact that our community was trying to persecute us for participating in protest. Like, resistance is inherently Métis, right? Like it is something that we do. And the fact that we were being reprimanded for folks were trying to get us reprimanded for something that is so a part of Métis culture, right? Is fighting for our rights, was really hurtful, I think, for both of us. And I can't necessarily speak for Simone, but from the conversations that we had, it was hurtful. It was hard, right, to hear that happen. And so I don't know if the people who said that necessarily thought of it having that kind of impact, but it did. Right. And so even sometimes jokes that we make that we don't necessarily assume are anti-Black can be anti-Black. Different ways that you personally can perpetuate it is by saying anti-Black things, of course, ignoring anti-Black behavior from others. I know it's hard sometimes, like I said earlier, to confront folks who are being anti-Black, but you have to do it. And especially if there's other Black Métis folks in the space, it's really hard sometimes for us to speak up. There was an elder that I was working with, a Métis elder. A youth had went to get something out of her bag and she had yelled, "Get your cotton picking hands out of my bag." And I was shook, like I was astonished. And I don't think she realized that, like, the gravity of that term. And she hadn't said it to a Black Métis person. She had said it to just another Métis youth. But in that moment, I was scared to speak up because it was an elder and no one around me was speaking up. And I didn't want to be the like angry Black person in the space. And so sometimes supporting, Black Métis folks in those spaces and speaking up when we don't necessarily feel like we can, like it's safe or we're comfortable, is really important, right? So when you stand by and you also let those things happen, you're helping to perpetuate that system. Spouting anti-Black stereotypes. So like I said, Black on Black crime. Another Métis community member, I'd come in from the cold and they had said, "Wow, look at your cheeks, rosy, even under that skin color." And I was like, Black people blush too. It's like, it's not, we do it too. But once again, in that moment, right? Like, they didn't realize that they were being anti-Black, and they didn't realize that it was this stereotype that Black folks can't blush, can't express emotions in that way, right? And then being weary of Black Métis folks. And when I say being weary, I mean, a Black Métis person walking into the space and your first assumption is, why are you here? Right? That is expressing anti-Black racism. And so what are some of the ways that you can address it? Well, standing up for Black Métis folks when others are anti-Black, like I had already said. Creating space for Black Métis folks. Like, so tonight, this space right here that we're having, these conversations that we're going to have tonight, that is a great way that you can create space for Black Métis folks. If you're putting together a Métis council at your school or in your community, are you actively looking for Black Métis voices? Are you making sure that Black Métis folks know that that space is safe for them and comfortable for them? I've done a lot of work with a lot of Afro-Indigenous youth and Afro-Métis youth, and a lot of them have said that they don't access Indigenous supports or resources because they feel that there's not space for them. They feel like they're going to walk into that space and be told no, right? So making sure that you're creating those spaces, right? So maybe just under your definition of who can be a part of your group, you can put Black Métis folks, right? It's important that you are advocating on behalf of folks who aren't necessarily in that space. Challenging structures of racism, right? So institutions, workplaces, which of course is always hard. And as Indigenous folks, as Métis folks, I'm never going to say put yourself in harm's way, because that's not, like, we also face extreme violence, right? But making sure that when you can, you are challenging those structures. And then including Black Métis voices, always, right? Making sure that we're included in conversations. I promise you, we're out there. If you don't necessarily know a Black Métis person, just putting a call out on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. I do it all of the time. If I don't necessarily know someone from a community that I want to include in something, I'm going to ask for them to show up, right? And I'm going to make sure that they feel included in those spaces. And then what can you do to change? So number one is unpacking personal biases. This is super important. And I say this even to Black Métis folks, like even as someone who is also Black, I have internalized anti-Blackness that I have to unpack. And that's because we live in a society that's inherently anti-Black, right? Those stereotypes, those narratives, those ideologies are pushed into all of us. And so we all have to challenge those biases that we have. And so it might look like sitting down and asking yourself, okay, what experiences have I had with Black folks or Black Métis folks, right? Has there been moments where I've perpetuated anti-Black racism? I promise you we all have. Every single one of us, right? You might not necessarily do it today or every single moment, but we've all done it at least once in our lifetimes, right? And you might not even realize it. So you have to really sit and think, okay, how have I maybe perpetuated this, right? Think about, okay, what stories or stereotypes have I been taught by family members, right? What exists within my family? On my Métis family, there was a lot of anti-Black racism that I don't think they thought as anti-Black. And growing up, I experienced it a lot and didn't realize that that's what it was when I was growing up, because I didn't have the language to describe what I was experiencing, right? And you might not even have noticed that it was anti-Black racism until now or maybe later, right? So it's thinking about those things. It doesn't mean that you need to sit in guilt and feel bad about yourself or start like tearing yourself down. That's not the point of it, right? Guilt is not a useful emotion. You can feel it, but it's really important that you feel it, move through it so you can move past it. So yeah, I feel guilty. I was anti-Black, but how am I going to do better, right? That's really what you have to think about. Read up on the experiences of Black Métis people is really important. We have our stories out there. I'm not the only Black Métis person in the world, so I encourage you reaching out to other folks, reading their stories, their think pieces, watching their videos, whatever it is that they put out there. And also just like Afro-Indigenous folks in general, right? Because a lot of our experiences are very similar, not completely the same, but a lot of Afro-Indigenous folks have had to combat the same things within community. And so you might learn something from someone else, right? So make sure that you're reading up and you're learning from others. And then do anti-Black racism training, which is kind of a new thing. Anti-racism training or oppression training is something that has existed for a long time. But anti-Black racism training is something that's come about in the last couple of years to really address the way in which anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness shows up in our communities, right? Or in our structures. So I really encourage folks, do an anti-oppression training, do an anti-racism training, but specifically do an anti-Black racism training. And something that's not on here, but something that you can do, right, is once again, challenging the people around you, right? So challenging your friends. That one's a hard one. It's really easy to get onto the internet and like argue with randoms that you don't know. But sitting down with a friend and getting them to unpack their own anti-Black racism is something that's super important. Something else that you can do, which is really great, is when you're sitting down with elders, read articles with them, which is always like a great opportunity. If they speak another language, so whether it's French, whether it's Michif, try finding out how to translate these terms or documents into the languages that they speak, right? How amazing would it be if there was a whole pamphlet in Michif on like how to address anti-Black racism in the community? You could be the person to do that. Right? So there's so many different ways that you can change, that you can challenge the systems that are around us. Because remember, like I said, anti-Black racism is not inherently Métis, right? It's something that unfortunately has been pushed on us. This is a little collage that I have of some Afro-Métis folks, some of which are my family members, but I decided to throw them in because I want to celebrate them. But these are some Afro-Métis folks who I've been able to share space with, have hard conversations with, and just also learn culture. I have Simone Blay up in the corner there, who I absolutely love and adore. We jigged together for a very long time. I definitely will never be able to jig as great as she does. Absolutely amazing. The skills, the footwork, the everything. But I did enjoy my time struggling next to her, trying to do my best. Layla at the bottom there is an amazing Afro-Métis youth who is currently in Peterborough, the Peterborough area. And what's super amazing about her experience is that a lot of Afro-Métis folks that I've met have been mixed specifically with Caribbean, like Black Caribbean and Métis, but Layla's actually Somali Métis, right? So there's all of these like dynamics of mixes of Black Métis folks that find really cool ways to incorporate their traditional cultures in with Métis cultures. There's my brother at the corner there at the bottom. His name's AJ. He's 14 years old, and he's been doing amazing work. He's a part of a youth council in Barrie. He's been advocating for Métis voices, Black Métis voices within the youth council and at the Friendship Center there. And him and his friends put together a really cool like cultural project. So that's something that he's doing at such a young age that I didn't get to do when I was younger because I didn't have access to culture. And so he's a prime example of why Black Métis folks having access to culture and community is so important. I have my other brother at the corner there, and he's come a long way. He too, like me, didn't start learning about his culture until he was older, but he has grown such a strong sense of his Métis identity that like no one in the world can argue with him about that, right? Like he's so proud of who he is. And I think it's such a beautiful thing to witness of him finding himself at an earlier age than I did. And then I have my cousin in the middle there with my papa. So my papa's Métis, Cree Métis, and that's them on a fishing trip. And so my papa growing up made sure that we really knew what it was like to live and eat and learn off the land, right? That practice of Métis culture. And so we hunted and we fished and we picked wild berries. And so a lot of our Métis culture comes from my papa that he taught us. And so I just wanted to like celebrate Afro-Métis folks for a second here. Because we're worth celebrating and we're worth including in these conversations of identity. So yeah, that brings me to the end of my talk. And I'm going to open it up for open discussion right now. So I think we're going to stop recording. I think